Welcome back to the Rational Educator podcast. Everyone living today only thinks of education in its current form, a highly regulated, top-down hierarchy in which authority figures decide curriculum and funnel it down to the classroom, led by another authority figure, the teacher. In today's episode, we discuss how this system came to be, and we introduce you to two of the major villains in the history of educational theory, Horace Mann and John Dewey. If you like what you're hearing from us, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss an episode. Email us over at info@rationaleducator.com and check out our new website, rationaleducator.com. There you'll find the latest news in the world of education, as well as resources for parents interested in homeschooling. Here's the episode. The American school and really worldwide education has unquestionably fallen on hard times. This is a subject of Andy's book, Why Johnny Still Can't Read. And this is not really in dispute. Parents are not happy with the state of education, but we have to know that this did not occur overnight. There is a long history behind the downfall of education, and that's what we're here to talk about. So we know that a lot of the roots for this occurred over a century and a half ago, and we know that the origin starts in Europe, specifically in Germany. So Andy, what can you tell us about the roots of where education began its downfall?
Yes, this is a good question, Joel, because I point out in the introduction to my book for the parents, it's like analogous to medicine. If we have some disease, we'd want to know the germs that cause it as part of, that's very helpful in finding the cure for it. And similarly in education and the downfall of American education, as you put it, it's really good to know the historical causes of how we got into the mess we're in. It helps illuminate what the solution would be. And we need to go back to the 19th century, and of course, Dr. Dan, I think, knows a lot more about this than I do. But here's my 2 cents on this. Horace Mann and several other Americans. I know what I've read, about this a long time ago. That there were a lot of American educators, educated Americans who were enamored of German philosophy, specifically Kant and Hegel. Kant died in 1804, Hegel in 1831. And then they were big deals in their lifetime. Germany, after all, is the land of poets and philosophers, right? And philosophy taken very seriously in Germany. And educated Westerners were enamored of German philosophy. You remember Lord Byron in his poem Don Juan, criticizing Coleridge? Well, Coleridge's reputation rests on a handful of poems, because I think he retired from poetry. I don't think he was even 30, because he was so in love with German philosophy. And Byron criticized him. What did he say? And Coleridge, explaining German metaphysics to the nation. I wish he would explain his explanation. There was a lot of Western intellectuals who were in love with German philosophy, including Horace Mann and others. And part of it is the authoritarianism of it. It's not a coincidence that Hegel, whose philosophy leads to both National Socialism and to Marx to communism, was comfortable in Prussia and loved Prussian authoritarianism and the Prussian school system, which trained young German kids to be obedient to the state. And these Americans were unhappy about the individualism and egoism of American culture and of the American founding, and that individuals have the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. which is certainly a selfish conception. And they wanted to discipline American culture. They wanted to bring, this ethos of obedience to the state. They wanted to undermine, maybe eliminate the individualism of American culture and replace it with obedience to the, you're citizen of the republic, you're obedient to the state. And Horace Mann was one of the more prominent American educators, 1830s perhaps. Journeys to Prussia, pilgrimages there, examines the Prussian school system and comes, admires it, and comes back to the United States. And in the mid-19th century, he's extremely active, studied in Massachusetts, but extremely active in pushing for a government school system, compulsory education in the government schools, where you would be trained. That kind of individualistic attitude would be would be drilled out of these kids, and so they become good citizens of the republic, meaning obedient to the state. I remember reading just a few last points on this. He wanted to, I don't remember the terminology, but something about discipline. I think it was, they wanted to discipline unruly American children. Now there's a nice spin, to put on. He wanted to discipline unruly American children, meaning he wanted to inculcate obedience to the state and wean the American individualism out of these kids. So really what we have here is a culture conflict, a philosophy conflict of Mann and his ilk did not like the 18th century Enlightenment, Lockean, Jeffersonian principles of individualism and individual rights, and they turned to the country that was burgeoning towards collectivism and statism and the primacy of the state over the individual, to Germany for inspiration in how to have a government school system that would inculcate the children with obedience to the state. That's what I know. That's what I know about Mann. And he's not a very good guy in my estimation.
So we know that America in the early 19th century was a very young nation and full of wide-eyed optimism toward the future, and founded on these principles of individualism, individual rights, and but it was a growing country, and one of the major concerns is how to keep growing, and education is at the heart of that. So it's, the situation in the early 19th century is akin to a young, bright, clever, intelligent child who looks to a parent. In America's case, that would be Europe, only to find that the parent is a sociopath.
Yeah, too bad they didn't look to Britain, as their actual parent, rather than to Germany. I say, even despite German culture's advances in so many areas, but German philosophy and collectivist politics is not the place you want to look to. I'm sorry, Deanna.
Oh, I was going to say, in the early 1800s, I don't think they wanted to look to Britain quite yet. They were still recovering. There was still some trauma there.
No, you're right. That's definitely true. I just want to say one last point before we turn it over to Dr. D. It's a canard that this idea that, and it's prevalent in the culture today, pushed by the left, and it's just accepted by gazillions of people who hear it all the time, that prior to the imposition of government schooling in mid-19th century, American education was not very good, and so it was designed to combat ignorance. Right, at the surface level, it sounds plausible. We have public schools, compulsory attendance, and we'll combat ignorance. But the truth is, American literacy levels and educational levels were very high. That wasn't the reason. I look at the proxy data that they use. In the early 19th century, Sir Walter Scott's novels and James Fenimore Cooper's novels, both of which are difficult reading. I think my college students would struggle with either of those writers. Those authors sold millions of copies to a country where the population was like 20 million. That's akin to selling tens of millions of copies today. And a little bit later on, late 19th century, the McGuffey's readers sold 120 million copies and were used to educate American children across the country, were much more sophisticated, vastly more advanced intellectually than the readers, like the Dick and Jane readers that the books say, advocates for having American kids read in the 1930s, 1940s. 80 years before that, the readers were much more sophisticated. There's a lot of proxy data like that to show, that American literacy levels and education levels were quite high prior to the imposition of government schooling. Parents in control and private education worked beautifully, as a free market does in agriculture and steel making or any other field.
All right, well, let's turn this over to Deanna, who has some things to say about how Horace Mann came to prominence and what were his influences.
The Prussian system originated in the rural areas in Prussia around the time of the revolution and that time afterwards. So late 1770s to the early 1790s, they created a school. And in Prussia at this time, there was, I believe there was some funding. And by the early 1800s, it took off in Prussia. And so their model of schooling is what we see. And by the early 18 teens, what you see are that they're now having teachers that need to be certified. So that idea that teachers have to be specially trained. I know Dr. Andy is a philosopher, and so that should sound kind of, now we're getting these philosopher kings that goes all the way back to Plato.
Yes,
and
does.
So there are these special things that people, special people are the ones that will be teaching now, which is very interesting because not that long before this time, I mean, you have people like Benjamin Franklin who are self-taught. After this time, Frederick Douglass is self-taught, and they're reading very impressive works that even I know I tried to teach my college students when I was teaching humanities, give them some of these primary sources that Ben Franklin picked up as a kid and Frederick Douglass, and they had a hard time getting through it. So I definitely agree with the level of literacy and complexity in the ability to read was much, much higher before we get this system that's going to spread like wildfire. So in the 1820s or 30s, there is a man who was from Michigan, and he goes to Prussia, and he's one of the first Americans. And then there's Horace Mann, there's George Bancroft, there's a few other people that go over there. I think there's about 5 or 6 over the course of about 20 years, go over, observe this system, think it's the best thing since sliced bread, even before sliced bread is invented. And they come back. And so this, in the mid 1830s, and his name escapes me, who the guy from Michigan went over there, he comes back and tells people within Michigan that are building the Constitution, and this Prussian approach is actually mentioned in the Michigan Constitution, which is quite interesting. And so then you get Horace Mann, who comes back, and he has a huge amount of influence. In fact, he's considered to be the father of public education. That's his sort of label. That's his big claim to fame, right? And so he comes back and in Massachusetts talks to the governor, and they decide to adopt it throughout. So in order to, we're talking about the Prussian system, but let me just kind of define some of the aspects that go into the Prussian system. First is that there are 8 years of compulsory education. After that, and free compulsory education. After that, parents have to pay. So there's 8 years of free public school. You have specialized teachers that are trained in specialized places, i.e. the teachers' colleges. And so there's kind of this special ability. Well, personally, having gone through a teacher's college, there's really not that much special stuff. In fact, what they're teaching nowadays, I think, is hurting. It's not even I know is hurting students. It's not helping. With the Prussian system, they also start figuring out ways to fund building of schools and to keep the schools going. And then you also have the supervision over the schools. So there's somebody who's monitoring to make sure that the instruction is what they want, that the teachers are certified or have gone through the special training. And so now in the suppression system, you're seeing this sort of oversight. And this is all in play before Horace Mann and these others go over there. So this is all going on. You also, for predominantly the education is secular, no religion in schools. So that's taken out. And there are maybe some religious classes in certain places, kind of like electives in Prussia, but religion is not to be taught in schools, which, that sort of separation of church and state that we have in our founding, that fit well. So there's certain things, the structure that, people have to be trained to teach children, even though I don't think that's true. And then this curriculum in Prussia was particularly interested in science and technology. Now, one thing that sort of kind of comes out of this also is in Prussia, following the Napoleonic Wars, they wanted an education system which was pretty much already set up. They need an education system when they lost in the Napoleonic Wars, where they can have students that will just follow orders. And so the Prussian system itself evolves over time, just like what we're going to talk about with, when we get to John Dewey. The American system evolves over time as well. And so when you look at the history of the Prussian education, you can look at the very early beginnings and then how things just get added and changed, and the purpose gets a little changed, particularly after those Napoleonic Wars, when Prussia's like, we just need people, or we need kids that are taught to follow orders and not think for themselves. Okay. And so that's really, if you know anything about history and, the Second World War, that makes a lot of sense, right? That these students are just very conditioned to following orders, sitting down, being quiet. And it sort of evolves conveniently in that you keep kids by peer group, by age group. So all 5 or 6 year olds are together, all 7-year-olds, all 8-year-olds. And it reinforces that idea of conformity and everybody just staying in line, stepping in line. And so that's kind of how it happens. And so Massachusetts starts this Prussian system, and compulsory education is part of this, in that there are now like what we would call truancy laws today, where children have to be in school. Like it is regulated that you have to be schooling your children. And this spreads in America. While it's spreading in America, it's also spreading in Europe. I mean, you have in Russia, even in some of the states within Russia, they're adopting the system, even though, the states within Russia, or Russia itself, is at odds with Prussia. There are some of the areas in the regions that adopt this system. It spreads to Scandinavia. Sweden adopts it. It spreads to other parts of Europe. And so not only is it coming to the United States, it's also spreading throughout Europe. And this is going to just become the norm of education, what everybody knows. It's what we know today, that you sit down, you're obedient, you just take what's given to you in lessons, you learn. And over time, it's really sort of adopted this idea that the teacher knows everything, the students, have to just absorb. And that's where we end up. And then that's what's happening when we get to the turn of the last century. And there's some educational debates that occur during this time period about the purpose of education. Why are we educating? Is it to have a civilized society? Is it to train people, train kids to be able to go find a job? Is it, what subjects do we want them to teach? Is it just math, history? Do we include literature? Is geography important? What is important to teach? And so you have all of these different camps and these sort of educational theorists in America that are starting to battle about the purpose of education. And this is going to be the latter half of the 19th century, the latter actually quarter of the 19th century in particular. And so you start having these education models where they're this kind of more liberal, what we call classical liberal, where it's just to have an educated society, versus we need students that can go into the workforce. And think about what's happening at the end of the 19th century. We're getting into the factory. We have, the Industrial Revolution is in high gear, and we need people to work in factories. So what's lovely about the Prussian system is that it helps train people to sit in rows and to sit and do work and be obedient, right? Just sitting in rows and desks in school trains you to sit in factories and be obedient. And it's really remarkable how the system of just trying to educate these, country kids has evolved into the system by the end of the end of the next century, the end of the 18th or the 19th century, that it really helps just have this conformist sort of society that learns not to question, not to revolt, not to get too angry, and just mind your P's and Q's.
This hierarchical authoritarian model of education is all any of us really know. So it's hard to imagine a different method of teaching unless you've gone through some kind of non-traditional schooling, like homeschooling, for example. For those of us who only have the authoritarian model in mind, if the Prussian school and that model is a departure from what came before it, well, we know that the Prussian school came at the tail end of the Enlightenment. So whatever came before the Prussian school produced the Enlightenment. So what was it that was so great about education prior to this model that we all know now that makes it so great?
Well, if you think about homeschooling today, that's kind of what it was, in that education was just really left up to the family. And so if you wanted your kids to learn to read and write, you would be doing that yourself. Now, for the wealthy, they could hire tutors. They could, have governesses that could teach children different things, foreign languages. Even in the Prussian system, girls often, this is for boys, this is compulsory education for boys. Girls aren't often included. And even for the elites, they could have governesses, or girls could be trained to be governesses or to work in some sort of domestic sphere. But prior to this compulsory type of education that we see in Prussia, it was really left up to the family. And even the elites, it was left up to the family, and education was a responsibility. So if you were a farmer, the most important education you could have was how to be a farmer on that farm. Now, in the evenings, you would probably be taught how to read, so you could read the Bible or you could read other things. Books were relatively still expensive, but in places, I know definitely in England, but in other places, they had lending libraries or these reading rooms where you could go and you could join memberships. And then some places they had free. Or if you had, for instance, in Jane Austen's case, she had some wealthy relatives, and so she had access to books. And so reading would have been taught even to the middle class, and it really depended up to the family. And so, and what they would be reading would be source material, what we would call primary source material. They would just be reading that. It's not a textbook. It's not a reader like the McGuffey's readers or even the Dick and Jane readers. Like, you are just going to the shelf of the library or finding a book that you have in your home, and that's what you're being taught to read with.
So
and so
I guess
this,
it's so I guess it's fair to say that the real distinction, what made the Prussian school such a departure from what came before it, is that the previous methods were individualized. They were on a case by case, student by student, family by family basis. There was no real overarching system in place. And the Prussian school attempted to codify it and to make it subject to an overarching authority that would impose their will on the society as a whole.
Exactly. You know, it's really interesting. If you look at history, and I'll just use Sparta because it's just a really fun example to use. So what did the Spartans do? They took young boys away from their families at a very early age to train them to be soldiers. What did the Prussians do? They take kids out of the home and train their minds, and they train them in education. And the outcome is the same. You take the kids away from the parents, get them away from that influence, and then you can't control them. And that's really what's happened here, which is why I'm such an advocate for homeschooling, because let's give the parents back that sort of power and onus over the children instead of having in the modern world, the government, or even in the Prussian system, or even in the Spartan system. It was some, like what you said, Joel, overarching authority that says this is what children need, and you're taking it away from the parents. And that's what's happened. And that's what compulsory education does. We know better. You don't know. You're just the parent.
All right. Looks
So
like
let
Andy
me-
wants
so-
to jump in here
yeah,
and say
yeah.
something.
I have a whole bunch of things to say. By the way, to your point, Dr. D, Andrew Coulson wrote an excellent book, Market Education, and he goes to the whole history of education, contrasting education under freedom when it's controlled by the parents with education under statism when it's controlled by the government. And he to your point, Deanna, he contrasts Athens with Sparta. Beautiful.
Yep.
You know, with the Spartan system, they just trained warriors, and these kids were basically illiterate. With the Athenian system, parents were in control of education. They produced one of the most advanced, and intellectually cultured civilizations of history. Now, and not an accident, by the way, that Plato, who was an Athenian, admired Sparta.
Yeah.
But to your point about prior to the 19th century Prussian system or prior to the Enlightenment, remember the Enlightenment is 18th century, and the Industrial Revolution, of course, is a direct result of the Scottish Enlightenment in the 18th century. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, in Britain and everywhere else in Europe and everywhere around the world, people were desperately poor by our standards, poorer even than any place in Africa today, because if we go to Africa today, we'll find some elements of modern agriculture and modern medicine and automobiles.
High-speed internet.
Yeah, high-speed internet, that's right.
Cell phones.
Automobiles, yeah, cell phones, aviation and such. None of that existed, obviously, in 17th or 18th century Europe, because those are all inventions of the capitalist era to come. So people were in desperate poverty, literally one half step ahead of starvation poverty. We're talking about a cold winter, kills the crops, and thousands of people die from famine. That's the kind of poverty, that we're talking about. So I think many people were uneducated. They worked from dawn, from sun up to sundown, and then they slept. The illiteracy rates were very high. But Deanna, you're absolutely right. Amongst the people who could afford to get an education, most of them were educated at home, but by mom and dad, and some great minds. I know American history more, and I know Benjamin Franklin, for example, who started the first subscription library in North America, and again, proxy evidence on how literate American society was. The demand for books and the success of the subscription libraries and contemporary 18th century Americans, writing about their peers saying that the dock workers, feel compelled to give their opinion on every matter. They've read this, that, or the other thing, and that it was the system of being homeschooled has always been very successful, and the private schools in America, 18th century during the American Enlightenment, literacy was generally a requirement of admission, that you were expected to learn to read and write at home from mom and dad, and that was not done at school. It was an admission requirement to get in. And there's all these commentators talking about American pioneers, late 18th, early 19th century. The American pioneers headed into the woods, with an axe, and a stack of newspapers. Included was a stack of newspapers and some books, and they read, and the dad read to the kids, or mom read to the kids at the breakfast table until one of the kids was old enough to take over the chore, and then he or she, did the reading. The homeschooling for the people who could afford it, who didn't have to work, 18 hours a day to eke out bare subsistence, was very effective. And once the Industrial Revolution raised people's living standards, it became clear, I think, certainly in the Western world, and I think this is true more broadly, most parents want their kids to get an education. They want their kids to read and write. It's a good example of that. Make one last point. If you've read James Tooley's book on the self-organized schools around the world, it's amazing. Goes into the most destitute countries imaginable, and you find these low-cost private schools, sometimes for-profit private schools, that are just flourishing. That parents who are very poor, they won't send their kids to the government schools because the kids don't get an education there. They'll send them to these small, privately owned and operated, sometimes for-profit schools, where they'll actually learn to read and write and learn math and everything. It really shows, one, that parents around the world, where they don't have to work 20 hours, they don't need the kids work in the fields, 20 hours a day. They want their kids to get an education, and they want their kids to get an academic education, and the private schools and do a homeschooling historically or today has done it much better than government schools.
Yep.
All right. So we know now that from our discussion that the real anomaly here is the government organized authoritarian model that started with the Prussian school. Even though that's what most of us have known all of our lives, that's really the anomaly in history. And that for most of human history, knowledge has been passed along to children from the home or through some kind of home driven model. So we see from the story that we're telling here that Horace Mann came to Prussia, learned this system, brought it back to America, and developed what we know of as the public school system today, starting from Massachusetts. So where does John Dewey fit in? Who wants to take this one?
Let me just say a couple of things, and I think Dr. D probably has more to say. We're talking about the influence of German culture, and including it, and perhaps especially German philosophy and German political philosophy. Well, let's not forget, John Dewey his field was not education.
Mm-mm.
John Dewey's field was philosophy. He had a PhD in philosophy from Johns Hopkins University, wrote his doctoral dissertation on Kant, and was heavily influenced by Hegel. And you try and read Dewey's philosophic works, like Experience in Nature. Oh my God, it's like trying to read Hegel. It's dense, to put it. It's density on steroids.
Okay, Andy, before you go on about Dewey's background, what can you tell the people in the audience who really don't know about Kant or Hegel, who they were in a nutshell, if that's even possible?
Oh yeah,
and why they influenced Dewey?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Good point. Good question, Joe. Immanuel Kant is, the most important philosopher of the modern world. German. I think the key point in this context is his ethics was one of duty. You should not pursue the moral rectitude lies in rejecting your personal selfish desires to do your duty. And Kant's known as the duty man in the history of moral philosophy. Doesn't have much to say about politics, but Hegel, who follows him, Kant's dates were 1724 to 1804. Hegel, Prussian, 1770 to 1831, one of the great political philosophers of history in terms of his influence. And Hegel was a state worshiper, for various technical philosophic reasons we don't have to get into. It was a very difficult, but Hegel's a state worshiper. The state, he's a post-Kantian Platonist. And you mentioned Plato before, both of you, and the philosopher king, and the idea that the intellectual and moral elite should rule and the rest of us obey. Well, Hegel had this idea that the state, with a capital S, is supreme over the individual. The individual must obey the state. In fact, as a direct quote from Hegel, I don't remember the exact wordings, but he said the individual's life belongs to the state. And if the state calls for the individual to give his life, the individual must give it. He says that in so many words. So he's a state worshiper, and the goal here, and it ties in with what we were talking about, the Prussian school system. Hegel's enormously influential, including
and obviously this runs entirely counter to the principles in the founding of our country.
Oh, absolutely. And so the Hegelian view, which is part and parcel of the Prussian view, because Hegel was Prussian and was very influential in his lifetime, and certainly even more so afterwards, when people came from all over Deutschland to study, with Herr Professor Hegel when he was alive, obviously. But the idea is the state is supreme, the state is preeminent, the individual is subordinate to the state. And like Dr. D was saying, that was the model of the Prussian system, to train citizens to be subordinate to the state. And that's what Horace, Mann, and those guys wanted in America, against, like you said, Joel, against the individualistic principles of America's founding. Not an accident that John Dewey is steeped in Germanic philosophy. And I don't want to sound like I'm anti-German, by the way. German culture has been magnificent in so many areas. You mentioned before the show, Joel, Goethe and Schiller, in the field of literature, and German music. If we can Germany and Austria is based, very similar cultures. Beethoven and Bach, and Mozart. We can go on and on. Robert Koch is like one of the great medical researchers of history. German engineering is a catchword. German culture has been magnificent, but I think German philosophy has been disastrous. It's been about duty. Hegel takes Kant, duty to whom? Well, it used to be to God. No, do your duty to the state. And now we're moving towards Nazism, towards communism. We see America moving towards, collectivist statist society where the state comes first and the individual must serve. And Dewey's, this is the last thing I'd say, I'll turn it over to Dr. D. Dewey's mentality, and of course, Dewey taught at the University of Chicago for a number of years, but then he went to Columbia in New York City. And well, Columbia Teachers College, is a preeminent teaching institution, and Dewey had an enormous influence. William Hurt Kilpatrick considered himself Dewey's leading disciple. He had the philosophy of education program, I think, at Teachers College at Columbia for decades. And their idea, Dewey, Kilpatrick, and at Columbia Teachers College, and progressive educators generally, is the full academic. Don't forget, IQ testing was just coming in the early 20th century. This is around the time of World War I. Well, IQ test the kids. What was it? Stanford Binet, right? The Stanford Binet IQ test. We'll IQ test the kids. We'll find the best and the brightest, and we'll give them the full academic program. I remember, 50 years later, I was in these IGC classes in elementary school, the intellectually gifted children. I was going to be one of society's leaders. I was going to get the full academic program and go to college. But the rest of us are a bunch of adults generally, and we need practical skills like driver's ed, sex ed, and hygiene and stuff, and sports are big because it trains the body. And the full academic program is not necessary. We're not going to college. We're not going to be part of society's leaders. So the vision is Platonic. The vision is the few, the proud, the educated will govern in the legislature and govern in the classroom, and the rest of us will be good at our jobs in our professions, and we'll obey the wise rulers of the state, and the state will be preeminent. And so we see Plato's influence here. Whereas Dewey is a post-Kantian Hegelian. Dewey, you see the influence of Plato filtered through Hegel and Marx. Marx spoke of scientific socialism, and the economists and the social scientists will rule the state. You won't have the helter-skelter of free markets. Everything will be planned out rationally. Well, I think Dewey and his ilk at Teachers College in Columbia very much had that vision. The vision was very political. We're going to create a Platonic Hegelian kind of state where people are trained from very young age to obey the wise rules of the state. I think that was definitely the big. And by the way, one last thing I want to say is 1920s, Dewey, William Herd Kilpatrick, some of these other professors at Teachers College, Columbia, where'd they pilgrimage? The way Horace Mann went to Prussia in, what was it, 1830s or 1840s, Jan? 1920s,
1940s.
1840s,
Mm-hmm.
1920s, they went to the Soviet freaking Union, and came back with glowing reports of education under Stalin, because the Soviet man was trained to serve the state. That I think tells us what the vision was.
All right, Deanna, what can you add to our characterization of Dewey? What kind of influence did he have? What kind of discussions were going on in his time? What were the conflicts that were in play during that time period in the field of education?
Yeah, so earlier in the episode, I talked about this sort of divide and these schisms amongst these prominent voices in American education. And I mean, this is going back to the 1850s. I mean, this is when Horace Mann is doing his thing, but Herbert Spencer and Lester Frank Ward, they had a schism. Spencer said that education really is for the elites. And if you know anything about Herbert Spencer, you know that he's not the nicest guy. He was had some very divisive, I guess you could say, theories about people, and he really wanted to just like focus on the elites, and everybody else was not worth even living. I mean, he was not the nicest guy in his philosophy, but he said that there's no reason for this sort of idea of classical education, of reading all these great philosophers, learning Greek and Latin, which was very common in the 1850s and even prior. I mean, that was just part of the standard education. And he said it should really focus on science, and that people really should just be, focusing on being a civic-minded individual. They should learn to appreciate the arts. And if you listen to what Spencer's saying, you could see that it's a very elitist. Lester Ward, on the other hand, said that against Spencer, they had a schism. He said that, well, no, education needs to be more about equality, and that it needs to be more about everybody having this opportunity to be educated. And that's one of the first major schisms that we see. Bringing the Prussian system, that really wasn't debated. I mean, people really sort of rallied behind that. So this is one of the first schisms that we see. Following that, you have sort of this idea of what's important in education. And, you have, is it about developing intelligence in children, and all children, just the elite children, who should be in school? And these debates continue. By the time you get to the 1890s, you get these two movements. One is this idea of having the educated be there for the good of society. And you also have those that are still advocating and trying to hold on to that idea of this classical, what we call classical liberal education, where you're just, becoming well-rounded. You're learning math, you're learning literature, you're learning Greek, you're learning Latin, and you're doing all of these things. And that goes right into where Dewey comes in. And so you have this idea of this, what's called essentialism, those trying to hold on to this classical liberal education versus those who really are more about getting a job, and this type of education where, everything is for the state. And it's often said the civic-minded individual, which sounds wonderful, but there are different interpretations of that. And the interpretation of Dewey and those on that camp, a civic-minded individual is somebody who gives up everything for the state, like what Dr. Andy was talking about. And so in these camps, you have those that are really trying to continue that long, steep tradition. I mean, we're going back to the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, of this classical liberal, where, the trivium, the Romans, where they would have, educated in math and science, or not science, but math and language such as Latin, but also learning Greek and logic and these subjects. And then if, you would have music added on to those things. But what you're doing is that you're training a mind to think for itself. And Dewey is on the opposite end of that, where you're training a mind to think what you want it to think. And that's really what's coming. Out of Dewey, you have these movements that are sort of this child-centered, and that's a big buzzword even today, and that often gets associated with Montessori, and then you kind of think about children just kind of running amok. But when they're saying child-centered movement, they're talking about children in the social sort of efficiency and doing what's right for the state, and focusing on how you can, what does a child need at age 7 versus at age 10 in order to fulfill these goals. And that really, if you think about it, that's happening in the early 1900s, within the first 20 years. And then it's just going to keep progressing, and the essentialists are going to fall to the wayside. Now, you do still have some popping up. You have things like the Great Books program coming forth. You have Mortimer Adler, and you have some of these, what I call heroes, trying to, like what these earlier essentialists were doing, trying to, still hold on to this bastion of just educating the mind to think for itself, to make its own decisions, to understand history, to understand, how to read in different languages and how to assess materials and look at a whole bunch of different sources and corroborate them. What I see is completely missing in modern education.
And Maria Montessori, we should mention, to talk about heroes.
Absolutely.
In that regard.
Yeah, and I think there's this sort of, I even had a misunderstanding of Montessori education, and I've become a huge proponent of it, because what it does, it's not that you just let children loose, there are lessons, and there is a very good way of teaching. You start building on concepts, and that's, and then you need this concept to understand the next concept, to understand the next concept. And that's what education has always been. Even if you're a farmer, you're not going to just run out and start, plowing the fields and planting. You need to understand about the soil. You need to understand about the process. And so there's all of these things that build up in knowledge. And that's definitely what Montessori was doing, but that's not what Dewey and all of that sort of ilk of early educational philosophers in the early 20th century were thinking about. Not how we can get students to have a base understanding of knowledge and how we can build upon that over time to increase their knowledge to where they can eventually, once they have enough base knowledge, that they can start pulling concepts together and think in abstractions and pull their own understanding. And I don't mean this in that every thing is correct, like postmodernism says, but it just allows the brain within the students over time the ability to learn, to memorize, to understand, and then to come to their own conclusions, whether they're right or wrong. They can at least start using their brain in those ways.
I think it's really important to underline that and really emphasize it, because what you're characterizing here is what we should think of as the goal of education, which is, you kind of put it as being able to think in concepts, being able to put 2 and 2 together, being able to think. But really, this is the most fundamental job of education. It is to train the mind, the individual mind, to think, and as you put it, think for themselves. And if we take what Andy said as to how he characterized the intellectual sources of people like Dewey and Mann, Hegel and Kant, there is a completely different conception of what the goal of education is, because they have a different conception of what it means to be human. So
what the state should be.
Sure, if you are training a legion of young people to be cogs in the machine, to be workers in the factory, if you think of the masses of humanity as being mindless drones who need to be put to work either in factories or as soldiers in your army, then you may try to develop an authoritarian system of education that does not emphasize the need to think for oneself, if what you're trying to do is produce a class of unthinking robots who will do your bidding as the philosopher king. On the other hand, if you think of human beings as individually thinking people who need to be filled with knowledge that will give them the ability to think, then you would devise your education system differently. Andy, what do you have to add to that?
No, that's absolutely right. The question of political philosophy is, what is the proper relationship of an individual to the state? And we see, on the one hand, I'm a philosopher, we see the big picture. Plato, Hegel, Marx, Dewey, they're statists. The state comes first, the individual obeys. And so it follows very logically in education that you want to train young children to be obedient. You want to discipline those unruly American kids, as Horace Mann put it. On the other hand, like you said, Joel, if your goal is a constitutional republic of individual rights, then of course we need to educate people to be independent thinkers. The government's not going to take care of them. The government's not going to tell them what to do. They're going to need to run their own lives, and they're going to need to be active-minded citizens in deciding on government policy. They're going to need to think for themselves, as Deanna put it. And there's the model of Maria Montessori, and like Deanna said, Mortimer J. Adler, Robert Maynard Hutchins, the great books. It fits the American model of teaching people to use their minds and to be independent thinkers. All the more important today, I think, post Ayn Rand, who showed in her seminal novel Atlas Shrugged, showed it in the actions and just talk about it, that for human beings, the mind is our instrument of survival. It's the means by which we grow food and cure diseases and build houses and cities and so forth. And with that understanding, it's all the more important to educate, children to be thinkers and to develop their minds. And I just want to say one last point on this. To me, the more I think about education and the more I research it, the acid test is, where does somebody stand on reading? It's amazing. They've fallen into these two camps. All of the statists, Mann, Dewey, all of these guys who want to train these kids to be obedient to the state, every one of them opposes phonics, like without exception. They prefer the word method. They don't want to teach the kids to sound out the words via letters. No, you look at the word in context. You try you memorize the shape of the word. If you can't remember the shape of the word, you guess. Now, the problem with that is any language has thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands, and did I say thousands of words? You can't possibly memorize the shape of all of them. So you're guessing a lot, and it's a terrible method to teach reading. Whereas with phonics, once you know the alphabet, you can sound out virtually any word in the language, even in English, which is an irregular language. Even in English, 87% of the words are phonetic. So so people who want kids to read, Maria Montessori, they all want to use phonics. And the people who don't want kids to read, they're against phonics. You can see why. Reading is the basic cognitive skill. If you want people to think for themselves, they need to read well. If you don't want them to think for themselves, you don't want them to read well. And Dewey said in so many words, he didn't want to teach kids to read at a young age, because he says, that's gaining knowledge, it's developing the individual mind. There's no social benefit in that. Dewey said in an infamous quote, there's no social benefit from that. Well, I mean, that's res ipsa loquitur, right? The thing speaks for itself.
Yeah, well, you can't make the practical argument that the look memorization method, the guess method, which I'd rather call it, is
it's a good name.
It's you cannot make the factual case that it is more efficacious in teaching reading.
No.
It's not possible. Yet,
No,
if you,
Rudolph Flesch went through every comparison, every test, of the method side by side. He went through them relentlessly. By the way, his second book was titled "Why Johnny Still Can't Read." I stole his title because you can't copyright a title, and nobody remembers his second book anyway. But he went relentlessly through every comparison and test of the method side by side. Every single one, without a doubt, shows that phonics is a much better method of teaching.
yeah, and so since you cannot make the factual case, then you've lost the argument for pushing it in schools, unless your real motivation is to destroy the cognitive ability,
Right.
and
That's
the
right.
and individual judgment.
Right. That's
So
right.
it is through reading, through mastering the skill of reading, that we can acquire knowledge and be able to make our own individual minds about the world.
Right.
And if that is destroyed, then it makes the authoritarians much more powerful. So we can see that through the arguments that the advocates of these guess methods make. They're not making factual arguments. They're making social ones.
Right. That's right.
So, and just one more point to add to that, and I've noticed this in the small amount of tutoring that I've done, is that those who are trained on the guess method, what they learn is not knowledge. It's not knowledge of a word or content. What they learn is how to appease a teacher. And so as they're guessing, they're looking for subtle clues about whether the teacher will approve of their guess. And to instill that kind of second-handedness at an early age and make it operable and make it acceptable is just monstrous, because it sets them up for that kind of second-handedness for the rest of their lives.
It's really true. I'm even teaching college. Students would always, if they did raise their hand, which was not all,
Is this on the test?
Is exactly. If they did raise their hand, there was a lot of trepidation. Like, am I going to be right? I need to be right. And I would always say, this is an open forum. I really welcome discussion, particularly when we're talking about some of these great authors and these great stories. And, you can internalize it and say what it maybe means today, but then, it would be my job as the instructor to put it into context and make them think a little bit outside of their own little worldview, to expand their minds and to get them to think on a larger scale. And they were petrified of that. And it was really sad. And I'm glad you brought up the test thing, Joel, because that's one thing that the Prussian system also did, was compulsory testing. And so that's why we have these standardized tests. I mean, we can thank the Prussians for one more thing. And so, this idea of teaching to the test, if you homeschool, you don't test. There aren't tests. There aren't, okay, it's Friday, it's test day. No, because everything is a classroom. Everything is learning. And it's really how education is meant to be. And if you just push right into 2021, when we're filming this podcast, in the last few weeks there have been a lot of articles in the news in some news about the role of parents in education. And now some parents are being deemed domestic terrorists because they're questioning school boards. So let's just think about this. Parents, for longer than, the last 200 years, or, even less than, a little over 200 years of this Prussian system, have been the ones in charge of educating their children and providing for their children and providing both, nourishment so they can eat, and everything they need, but also intellectual nourishment. is now the system has gotten to be such the norm, and the idea that the state has so much control and power, and they know, and these teachers that go through these teachers colleges are the philosopher kings, and we know better than parents. It is, I mean, I really think I'm just reading some dystopian novel from the early 20th century. It is shocking what is happening. And all I can say to that is homeschool, homeschool, homeschool. It is legal in every state. Figure out a way to do it. There are so many resources out there. It's completely possible, but take back education. Parents really need to take this back in order for students and kids to not have their minds destroyed.
I agree 100%. Parents have, in reality, parents have full and final authority over the education of their children. They need to realize it and take it back from the government, and tell, the government schools, even the private schools and tutors, you work for us. You're the hired help. I was making this point last week. That's not derisive. People hire me to tutor them. They tell me what the kids are to learn, and then I'm the expert in philosophy or literature. I implement it, but they set the terms. The parents set the terms. They hire me and they pay me to do it. So it's a noble profession to teach, but we need teachers and tutors like us. We need to realize parents have the full and final say properly over what their children learn, and we work for them. Parents need to realize that.
Well, our journey into the state of education and its decline has only just begun. We've only gotten to about the 1920s or so. So we will continue this in upcoming episodes. But for now, I want to thank our panel, Drs. Bernstein and Heikkinen. Thanks for being on our episode of The Rational Educator.
Thank you for having me.
Great
Always fun.
Great to be here, Joel, and it's always great to talk to the lovely Dr. B. So yes, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Rational Educator podcast. Let us know what you're thinking. Drop us an email at info@rationaleducator.com. And check out our new website, rationaleducator.com, where you can find the most up-to-date news in the world of education and find resources that you can use to make your education journey better. We'll see you next time.